trade barriers, American trade, and American jobs increase. Trade is the lifeblood of my home state of Texas. Last year in Texas, almost 1 million jobs were supported by some form of trade. Texas has been the top exporting state in the United States for 14 consecutive years. The overwhelming majority of Texas exporters are not big corporations, but 93% of the Texas exporters are small and medium-sized businesses. In my district of Houston, over half of the economy depends on trade. Houston is one of the largest ports in the world and is the oil and gas capital of the world. And guess where our Texas exports export the most? Mexico and Canada, our NAFTA partners. Mexico is Texas's #1 exporting partner. Over 10,000 trucks a day cross the Texas-Mexico border, all involved in trade. Texas is just one of the many states that rely on NAFTA to fuel the economy. Study after study has shown that increased trade leads to increased jobs for all Americans. More jobs mean more wealth for Americans. NAFTA supports 14 million jobs in the United States, and thanks to NAFTA, trade between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada has tripled. Nearly every industry is affected in one way or another by NAFTA. The U.S. economy relies on NAFTA. Free trade agreements like NAFTA do more than just grow our economy. Trade is one of our best tools for foreign policy and political policy. We have seen the connection between free trade and freedom, opportunity, and prosperity. When we signed the NAFTA agreement, Mexico was considered a developing country. Its economy was one of the most closed in the world. Now, thanks in part to NAFTA, Mexico's open economy valued at $2.2 trillion. The growth has made Mexico a stable neighbor. This increased trade between our countries has also deepened the ties between Mexico and Canada, allowing us to work together on many critical issues. Today, we cooperate with the Mexican government on numerous issues. Surprisingly to some Americans, including border security, immigration, and the fight against organized crime and drug trafficking. Our southern border security depends on our joint effort with Mexico. Cooperation with Canada has improved due to NAFTA. Our forces train and work together to defend North America. We fight side by side against national security threats like ISIS, and we are NATO partners. These are some of the critical issues, our national security and our security to our world. Brings me to the reason we have this hearing today, to address the renegotiation of this critical free trade agreement. This negotiation or renegotiation is going on as we speak. A lot has changed in 23 years. The Internet has transformed the way companies do business. Reforms in Mexico have created new opportunities for U.S. businesses. The renegotiation presents an opportunity to update the agreement in areas like energy, e-commerce, customs, and trade facilitation, and many others to strengthen and promote trade. While there's a lot of opportunity to strengthen the agreement, there's also the risk of hurting U.S. businesses and workers. Hundreds of thousands of jobs across North America could be at risk if we suddenly just pulled out of NAFTA or weaken the agreement. We could do damage to our partners with Mexico and Canada that have made North America so strong. There has been some criticism, maybe harsh criticism by others, of NAFTA for decades. But we must separate the rhetoric from the facts and the criticism from people that don't have anything to do with trade. The fact that is that NAFTA has benefited all three of our nations. I encourage the administration to strengthen and modernize NAFTA. There is always room to improve it, to make it better for all three countries. And we have the rare opportunity at this very time to rewrite the rules of North American trade, to make it free trade and fair trade. We must take the opportunity to write them for the better. I believe it's important to the U.S. economy and national security that throughout the renegotiations, the administration focuses on reaching an agreement that promotes free trade as well. We're sending a message to our current and future trading partners throughout this renegotiation. The U.S. should send a strong signal to support not only the NAFTA free trade agreement, but free trade with other countries as well that want to trade with the U.S. A strong U.S. economy depends on a strong framework of free trade. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the administration can strengthen NAFTA and make it better. I will now yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating, former prosecutor, maybe still a prosecutor, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Chairman Poe, and thank you for having this hearing today. We're here in the Subcommittee on Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade, and as anyone who watches the news knows, there are many threats facing us today in these areas: ISIS, lone wolf attacks, escalating tensions with North Korea, and the threat, again, of nuclear war. We must be vigilant in addressing every threat here at home and in the globalized world. The threats that cross borders and affect all of us are important. Threats from terrorism and proliferation of nuclear weapons are sobering. We must do everything in our power to keep Americans safe. But additionally, we cannot afford to lose sight of trade. It doesn't command as much attention in the news as some of these issues I've just mentioned, but it affects every single American. Trade has the power to affect where jobs are located, to affect wages, to affect the cost of goods and services we rely on every day without even thinking about trade policies that affect them, and they're in front of us. Trade is an incredible economic and foreign policy tool if it's wielded effectively and responsibly. It's the duty of the U.S. government to take full advantage of every tool at our disposal to make life better and easier for everyday, hardworking Americans. In order to do that in trade, we must be extremely careful in examining who wins and who loses. There's been a similar debate raging in this country over winners and losers recently, and that's over taxes. There are a lot of numbers and mathematical formulas and technical terms being thrown around with these issues, but at the end of the day, how sure are we that it's the student, the assembly line worker, the farmer, the mother of three, how sure are we that they are seeing the benefits of these policies? Good news is that there are things we can do in trade so that all boats rise, because our economies, our security, our institutions are all stronger when the people at the receiving end of trade and tax, and any policy for that matter, are stronger. However, we also have to be honest about what that means, because in trade, this is not the norm. It's not going to take real work to renegotiate. It is going to take, rather, real work to renegotiate NAFTA so that Americans, Mexicans, and Canadians see the benefits of what an effective, responsible trade policy should look like. Unfortunately, on this issue, which will have a significant impact on each and every American's bottom line every month, I remain unconvinced that this President has approached this issue with the seriousness it demands. For starters, the unrealistic timing parameters placed on these negotiations only suggest that the administration is willing to accept more of the same. I hope I'm wrong about that, but negotiating wholesale changes in trade policy that break with longstanding trade practices takes time, no matter how quickly we might want to change that to happen and how willing we are to make sure it works towards that end. This applies to tax, trade, it applies to anything. We should be very careful about anything that moves quickly in the city, and with very little oversight from Congress or engagement from the affected stakeholders and their representatives, this is an area of concern. To our role in Congress, I'm glad we're having this hearing in our subcommittee today because it's a critical issue for our country and our foreign policy. We're fortunate to have our expert panel of witnesses here to inform us and inform this discussion right here in Congress on the NAFTA negotiations, and what we should be paying close attention to so that we're serving the interests of the hardworking Americans in our own districts. While I'm pleased with our witnesses here today, they are not government witnesses. Our panel, they're really not the ones that are going to be in the room negotiating this when it happens. They're not negotiating in terms of the trade policy that might have the single greatest impact on our constituents during our time serving here in Congress. They are not serving at the State Department, the Office of U.S. Trade Representative, USAID, the Department of Labor. They're not working in our federal agencies tasked with taking a new NAFTA and making it function properly at all levels of implementation, down to the workers in the fields or the assembly line or the parents buying groceries. With something of this significance, we owe it to our constituents to be fully informed on the terms that are being written into the new NAFTA, on the economic effects those terms will have on our communities back home, on what we need to do as the United States government to make sure that everything is in place if and when a new NAFTA is signed. Because there are always risks and uncertainties when new policy is put into place, and we should work together to make sure people are not harmed in the process. For today, with this opportunity before us, in what I hope will be the first effort at taking up the issue of NAFTA negotiations, I hope we can use this time today to learn more about what a successful renegotiation looks like. Trade is just like any other issue: tax, healthcare, financial regulation. We've learned a lot from how past practices have gone, and we've learned about who the winners and losers were under those policies. We are better not to be repeating those same mistakes. Our communities back home deserve better. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. Without objection, all of the witnesses' prepared statements will be made part of the record. I ask that each witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes, and it's an easy way to know how long 5 minutes has passed because a red button will blink in front of you. But we do have all of your testimony. All members have your testimony and your bios as well. I'll introduce briefly each witness and let them make their testimony. Eric Farnsworth is the Vice President of the Council of the Americas. He previously worked at the State Department, Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and was a senior advisor to the White House Special Envoy for the Americas. Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth, for being here. Mr. Daniel Alford has been the president and owner of ARC Specialties of Houston, Texas for 35 years. ARC Specialties began as a one-man operation and grown into the internationally recognized automation company that employs 65 engineers and craftsmen. Mr. Alford, thank you for being here and taking time away from your business. Ambassador John Negropani is Vice Chairman of McClarty Associates. He was previously the Deputy National Security Advisor under President Reagan and was the first Director of National Intelligence under President George W. Bush. In addition, he served as the Ambassador to Honduras, Mexico, Philippines, the UN, and Iraq. Ms. Celeste Drake is a Trade and Globalization Policy Specialist for the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations. Previously, Ms. Drake worked for Congressman Sanchez and Congressman Doggett, in addition to serving on the Advisory Committee for the U.S. Export-Import Bank from 2013 to 2016. Mr. Farnsworth, we will start with you. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon to you, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of the subcommittee. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to appear before all of you to discuss the future of NAFTA. If I may, let me give you the bottom line first. NAFTA was a true innovation in economic relations. It was designed to increase trade and investment among its three parties, promote North American economic integration, and support a vision of open market democracy for Mexico, providing that nation with a clear path toward political and economic development. It has succeeded on all three metrics, promoting our strategic, economic, and foreign policy interests, as well as our values. Ending NAFTA would be a significant, lasting, and wholly unnecessary strategic mistake. At the same time, it is inevitable that after almost a quarter-century, NAFTA has become dated and can usefully be modernized, and there is a landing zone if the parties would like to achieve it. Since 1993, U.S. trade in goods and services with Canada and Mexico increased from $307 billion to well over $1 trillion by 2016. Annual trade between the United States and Canada has more than doubled. With Mexico, trade has quadrupled. Canada is the top trading partner of the United States, and Mexico is our second largest export market and third largest trading partner. More than 40 U.S. states count either Canada or Mexico as their top export destination. NAFTA has expanded trade and investment while organizing the majority of North American economic relations under a rules-based framework. As China continues its inexorable march up the development ladder and becomes increasingly economically assertive, our ability to compete economically will be further enhanced from a North America platform rather than the United States alone. Perhaps more importantly, NAFTA institutionalized a vision for North America that would have been impossible absent significant political and economic reforms in Mexico, both catalyzing such reforms and also benefiting from them. NAFTA has directly supported Mexico's democratic transformation while also establishing a framework of trust, supporting close U.S. cooperation across a range of security issues, including counter-narcotics, counterterrorism, and migration. Such cooperation is at risk if the United States continues on its current path. Negotiations to revise NAFTA are now well underway. Press reports indicate that the most difficult issues remain to be addressed. Unless they are soon resolved, the possibility is increasing that talks may break down altogether and that the U.S. might consider giving notice of withdrawal. According to the Wall Street Journal, some 80% of economists surveyed anticipate withdrawing from NAFTA would depress U.S. growth, even as Congress is right now pushing forward on a tax package designed to kickstart growth. Withdrawal would also reduce growth in both Canada and Mexico, perhaps leading to recession and creating economic conditions that traditionally cause migration, especially from Mexico to the United States. Much depends on the outcome of discussions surrounding rules of origin as a means to address the trade balance, although other significant issues also remain, including a sunset provision proposal and disagreements on intellectual property, government procurement, and dispute settlement procedures. Backward steps on these issues would cause irreparable damage to fully integrated supply chains and the workers whose jobs depend on them, in part because companies would find it difficult, if not impossible, to meet the required rules of origin currently under discussion. Were NAFTA to be eliminated, the parties to the agreement would then return to previous bound tariff rates, Mexico's being far higher than ours. Agriculture exports would suffer immediately, giving up the significant advantage that has turned Mexico into the U.S.'s second largest $18 billion market after only Canada. Meanwhile, to escape tariff barriers raised by Mexico, those seeking to supply Mexico's growing market and increasingly middle-class population may in fact seek to move production to Mexico. This is exactly the opposite of the intended result. Having said all of this, the uncertainty that has been caused by the negotiations has already had negative consequences. Doubts will linger about whether the word of the United States, even one that is confirmed on a bipartisan basis by both houses of Congress, can be fully trusted again. Were we intentionally to seek ways to undermine our own global strategic interests, we might not find a better means of doing so than this. The challenges that face the United States at this moment are significant and they're real. But NAFTA is not the culprit. Rather, the relaunch of an updated and modernized NAFTA, fully acknowledging the rapid technological advances that continue to be made, informed by a vision of a more economically integrated North America to compete effectively on the global stage, is part of the solution. And in the meantime, the strong, public, timely assertion by Congress of institutional prerogatives on trade, and NAFTA in particular, would be a welcome and, in my view, appropriate step. So I want to thank you again, Judge Poe, and the Ranking Minority Member for the opportunity to be with you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Farnsworth. Mr. Alford.
Mr. Poe and members of the Terrorism, Nonproliferation, and Trade Subcommittee of the Committee on Foreign Affairs, thank you for inviting me today to talk on NAFTA. I'm Dan Alford, President of ARC Specialties in Houston, Texas. We design, program, and build automated machines and robots used around the world. I started in 1983 in Houston when I built a hot tap welding machine for a plutonium processing plant in Idaho. I've always suspected that if the customer had known it was a young man in his garage building this, they might have been a little worried. However, it worked so well, we built another one in the 90s. The business grew out of the garage around 1990, and over the last 35 years, we've engineered and built hundreds of machines that are operating in 25 countries on 6 continents. We now occupy over 100,000 square feet of engineering and manufacturing space and employ 65 engineers and craftsmen. I've personally worked in and observed the market systems in 15 different countries. This experience has made me an enthusiastic free market capitalist. ARC Specialties has always built machinery used for the manufacture of equipment used in the exploration and refining operations in the energy industry. In 2015, when oil prices crashed and the Houston economy slowed, we needed new markets. We found that the solutions we developed to solve oil industry problems worked equally well in other industries around the world. Since the beginning of 2015, we have designed, built, and shipped machines to Canada, Mexico, Romania, Singapore, Oman, Saudi Arabia, China, India, France, and the UK. Exports have accounted for 30% of our revenues. Canada and Mexico accounted for half of our exports. In the process, we've learned to deal with trade barriers ranging from red tape to tariffs. Most of my knowledge of NAFTA comes from personal experience doing business across the globe. My experience is that NAFTA has helped us sell machines in Mexico and Canada. I sincerely believe that the free market system used here in the United States is a major contributor to the success and productivity of our country. Tariffs and subsidies distort markets and degrade efficiency. A free market and a level playing field bring out the best in people by rewarding their efforts. I firmly agree with the adage that competition breeds excellence. In 1960, one transistor cost $4. Now $4 will purchase 1 billion transistors. This is the result of the free market encouraging technological improvements through automation. The whole process is driven by fair competition. I don't fear competition. I relish the challenge. I can beat the competition, but I can't beat the tariff. The United States innovates, others duplicate, then the cycle starts over, and everyone benefits from increased productivity. Better products are made available to consumers at lower prices. What I do fear is an unfair environment. Tariffs and red tape on one side tend to create reciprocal tariffs and red tape on the other. Technical problems can be solved using engineering and ingenuity, while tariffs create political and administrative cost barriers that restrict trade. I export machines to Brazil, where Brazilian tariffs can add as much as 40% to the cost of my equipment. This is counterproductive for all parties. These machines are used to apply welded internal coatings to valves and pipes used in the oil industry. These coatings create a corrosion-resistant barrier to the hydrogen sulfide or sour gas present in Brazilian crude and help prevent catastrophic failures and oil spills. Brazilian tariffs make my machines unaffordable for most companies. These tariffs cost my company revenues and cost the U.S. jobs. I fear the same thing will occur in Mexico and Canada if changes are made to NAFTA that distort the free market system. I believe that everyone should have an opportunity to work and provide for their family. This is a great stabilizer in the world. In a free market system, prices for goods and services are determined by the open market and consumers. A free market works when the laws and forces of supply and demand are unhindered by government intervention. I'm proud to be involved in manufacturing because it's one of the few segments of our economy that creates wealth. Our robots and machines help U.S. companies compete in a global economy, and our exports of equipment help the balance of trade. I'm honored to be here today, and I ask you to help me to continue to create jobs in the United States of America by encouraging international free trade.
Thank you, Mr. Alford. Well said. Ambassador?
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman. Oh, I think it's on. Talk. Yeah, talk, sorry. I should have remembered at least that. I haven't been out of government that long. Thank you, Chairman Poe and Ranking Member Keating and other members of this subcommittee for inviting me to testify at this hearing on NAFTA, a topic that has long been of personal and professional interest and that is highly relevant for Congress at this critical juncture. NAFTA's modernization is both necessary and important. For my part, I'm proud to say that I've been an advocate for transforming North America into a more competitive economic force for decades. During my time as United States Ambassador to Mexico, I had the privilege to be involved in NAFTA's conception and negotiation. When I went down to Mexico, our trade relationship was modest, and the United States-Mexico political relationship was frequently fraught. Distant Neighbors was the title of the book that best described our bilateral interaction. Through NAFTA, we hope to be able to integrate our economies in a way that would benefit all three countries and allow us to better compete, including with Asia and with the countries of Eastern Europe that were emerging after the fall of the Soviet Union. I will never forget my meeting with President George H.W. Bush and Secretary of State James Baker, where I walked through the pros and cons of having a NAFTA, an idea that they green-lighted, seeing the economic and security benefits in such a strategic alliance. While the economic and social pressures of an increasingly globalized world have made NAFTA a controversial subject, I am of the view that NAFTA has been beneficial to our country. Its renegotiation should recognize the strategic importance of our North American partnership from both a geopolitical and economic perspective. Our work with our neighbors on law enforcement, counter-narcotics, and counterterrorism are key components to keeping America safe. We simply do not have the luxury of putting this collaboration at risk. And economically, trade with Canada and Mexico supports millions of jobs, and our North American partners buy more U.S. manufactured goods every year than the next 10 largest markets combined. Rather than offshoring to Asia, critical supply chains have been able to remain in North America, enhancing our ability to compete. NAFTA created unprecedented export opportunities for U.S. manufacturers, farmers, energy and service providers, small and medium-sized enterprises, and yes, even workers, building the foundation of a closer strategic trilateral partnership. At the same time, NAFTA has long been a punching bag, as our country has failed to effectively address the needs of communities hit by shifting market demand, enhanced globalization, and technology. These are pressing matters that we must take head on, but withdrawing from NAFTA to attempt to address these issues is like putting a splint on your arm to try to heal a broken leg. It is not likely to work. The uncertainty created by withdrawal benefits no one, least of all the United States. Do we need to modernize this agreement? Absolutely. The world has moved on since NAFTA's entry into force. Do we need to threaten withdrawal to do so? Absolutely not. So what can we do? First and foremost, I think it's important that Congress exercise its prerogatives in matters concerning trade and commerce. Hopefully, this hearing will be a piece of that. And my hope is that local communities threatened by a dissolution of NAFTA will help to build a national consensus for the status quo, ideally for NAFTA modernization as well. Most importantly, I think we must rebuild a consensus, not on trade necessarily, but on competitiveness, on the need to ensure that the United States remains one of the most competitive economies in the world. This will mean engaging in real policy debates about the causes of economic struggle in certain parts of the country, rather than turning to NAFTA as a convenient scapegoat. Wouldn't it be ironic if it were the United States' actions that harmed the bilateral relationship with Mexico, returning us once again to being distant neighbors? Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ms. Drake.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Poe, Ranking Member Keating, members of the committee. I'm pleased to testify about NAFTA on behalf of the American Federation of Labor and Congress of Industrial Organizations, representing 12.5 million working people in every sector of our economy, including mining, retail, manufacturing, transportation, public service, and construction. While CEOs and global corporations have generally benefited from NAFTA, it has failed the working people of North America. While it has increased the amount of trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States, it has also cost jobs, depressed wages, weakened worker negotiating power, and destabilized communities across all three countries. Trade will always be disruptive, both creating and destroying jobs, but NAFTA's rules redistributed income upwards, providing rewards to the wealthiest and most powerful, while making it tougher to succeed for the rest of us. Trade does not inevitably have to redistribute income in this manner. So if we change the rules, we can change the outcomes. That's why today's hearing is so important. The renegotiation process that began in August is continuing even as we meet today here in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Due to the secrecy of the talks, we cannot discuss at this open hearing the specifics of the texts that each party is proposing. But we do know some of the general outlines. Canada has been very transparent about its ambition to protect its workers from being undercut by U.S. and Mexican policies that suppress wages by limiting the negotiating power of working people. And the U.S. has been equally transparent about its proposal to limit NAFTA's special legal privileges for foreign investors, which act as a subsidy for U.S. employers who outsource to Mexico. The AFL-CIO believes these proposals represent positive steps toward the transformation of NAFTA that is necessary to reverse its race-to-the-bottom model. We also commend Ambassador Lighthizer and his team for their willingness to consult with labor. But initial steps and respectful consultations are not sufficient to provide confidence that the future of NAFTA will vary from its past. To truly set up a fair and level playing field, NAFTA renegotiation must address labor issues that were basically swept under the rug the first time around. NAFTA's labor and environment side deals must be replaced with clear, effective, binding rules in the core text. Put simply, NAFTA's side agreements don't work. Over 23 years, they have done nothing to ensure that NAFTA's labor rules are monitored or enforced, including in the case of Mexico, where the government cooperates with employers and employer-dominated unions to keep wages low and workers from having an independent voice in the workplace. Indeed, just last week, 2 senators from Mexico's ruling party introduced a bill that would undermine constitutional amendments as well as commitments already made to the U.S. This failure to address long-standing denials of worker rights and freedoms in Mexico is a key reason that NAFTA has not raised wages, benefits, or freedoms for North American families. If effectively addressing Mexico's entrenched system of labor repression is not part of the NAFTA renegotiation, there is little chance that it will stop hurting North American families. For this committee, this issue is critical. Working people, not just in the United States, but around the globe, have been expressing more and more doubt about the current model of globalization. Not about trade, but about global economic rules that reward exploitation and pollution, that fail to protect migrant workers, that deny working families open access to global rulemaking, that provide special privileges to Wall Street banks and brand-name pharmaceutical companies, and that make the American dream harder to reach, particularly for the 2/3 of working Americans who lack a bachelor's degree. Congress should demand that NAFTA's negotiators think bigger. Negotiators must consider how to incorporate rules that allow the U.S. to develop manufacturing policy to bring new family wage jobs to our industrial heartland. The new NAFTA should also include rules to combat tax avoidance and promote infrastructure investments. Without such rules, disinvestment in the U.S. economy will continue to undermine productivity and the middle class. For NAFTA to have a bright future, it must incorporate lessons learned from mistakes of the past, including the failed 9-year case against Guatemala. A new NAFTA that addresses these issues should be viewed as the first of a new line of trade deals that have the confidence of the people making the products and providing the services that are traded. I'll stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank all of you all. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Just answer this question, yes or no, it's easy. Has NAFTA benefited the United States? Mr. Farnsworth?
Yes.
Mr. Alford?
Yes.
And Ambassador?
Yes.
Ms. Drake?
No.
3-1. Mr. Alford, you heard the testimony of Ms. Drake, and you started out as a single owner, inventor, business person, worker. You were all of the above when you started. You said NAFTA has helped you. You have 65 employees, is that correct?
That's correct.
How much of your trade, how much do you trade with Mexico? Can you give me a percentage? Give us a percentage.
Over the last 3 years, it's been 15% of our revenues, but it fluctuates year to year.
Okay, how about Canada?
Again, the same, 15%.
What would happen to your business if the United States hit the road with NAFTA?
We'd probably lay off 15 people.
Ambassador, there's been, I mean, the renegotiation with NAFTA is taking place now. What should we do, the United States do, to make it better, specifically?
Well, I think some of the changes, the new concepts that were introduced to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which of course we have not entered into, we've withdrawn from that agreement, but in that TPP negotiation, things like intellectual property protection, e-commerce, updating the labor and environmental provisions, those kinds of features are things that I believe ought to also be introduced into a bilateral or into the NAFTA discussion, and my understanding is that they have been, although like Ms. Drake, I haven't seen the specific language being discussed.
So you agree with her that we need to update the labor provisions in NAFTA?
Yes, and
for the United States. That would benefit the United States.
Right, and just as a reminder of the history of this, I think we got to remember that in 1993 and 94, the labor and environmental provisions were sort of an afterthought. In other words, Mr. Bush signed the agreement, and then Mr. Clinton, as a condition when he came into office for actually going through with the agreement, insisted on negotiating these environmental and labor accords. And so it really was an afterthought. I think now it's less so.
Mr. Farnsworth, I mentioned in my opening statement that the United States policy, economic policy, foreign policy, whatever you want to call it, we seem to get involved in working with countries across the seas and trying to help their economy, but we seem to ignore our neighbors, specifically helping the economy of Mexico, which I think not only helps Mexico, it helps us. Do you agree with that statement?
Judge Poe, I strongly agree with that statement, and I thank you for raising that as a priority of this hearing. Mexico also has politics, and Mexicans will go to the polls in July for a presidential election. It's too early at this point to declare who's going to be the winner in Mexico, but simply to say that to the extent they feel that the United States is being a partner that is looking to distance the relationship rather than make it closer, that could very well encourage folks to vote for candidates in the Mexican process who may take a view of the United States that's less charitable. And the last thing we would want, in my view, would be to have a Mexico that views the United States in the way that we had in terms of the relationship back before NAFTA was finalized. We have to remember that the recent relationship over the last 23, 24 years is actually not the traditional relationship that Mexico and the United States have had. That relationship tended to be more acrimonious at times, but at the best of times, benign. Now, over the last 23, 24 years, we've had the opportunity for real, intensive, and mutually supportive cooperation across a range of issues, yes, on the economy, but also on the security side and on the migration side, and that would be put immediately at risk. Mexico has its own interests. They might view some of these issues differently, and I think we have to remember that.
Historically, the relationship between Mexico and the United States, especially Mexico and Texas, has been tense, in my opinion, and it's changed for the better, but slowly. I think we need to work with our next-door neighbors and look at them closer than we start people across the seas. And one last question. Does Mexico and Canada want to renegotiate NAFTA? Anybody can weigh in on this, just yes or no.
Yes, they have indicated a willingness to do so.
Ambassador, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, yes, sir. I think they do, but within limits. I think there's some provisions that have been suggested that I think they probably would not be willing to accept. For example, a sunset provision, a 5-year sunset provision, would be one, I think, rather a significant example of
sunset
that.
Provision would be bad for business, wouldn't you think?
Well, it's hard to make an investment.
That's right.
You only got 5 years.
I'll yield to the ranking member, Mr. Keating from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And indeed, a lot has happened over the last decades since the NAFTA agreement was negotiated. One of those areas really and I mentioned the growth of Mr. Alfred's business is indicating that. The growth of artificial intelligence and robotics and the new industries there. So I'd like to ask you all, given that, what importance in retraining workers and preparing them for new industries should be part of this agreement in terms of promoting this? Can we use this opportunity to deal with the dislocation that comes from these new industries? Can we use this to make sure that American workers have the option of retraining and have the resources to do it and preparing them for these new industries? Ms. Drake?
Thank you. I think not only can we, but we must do that. The problem is that all the training and education in the world doesn't create one single job. So while we're investing in training and education to get U.S. workers up to a world-class level, we also have to make the investments that will help create the jobs. So promoting innovation, investing in infrastructure, making the U.S. a more attractive place to invest. Right now, it takes as long for a freight train to get from Los Angeles to Chicago as to just get through Chicago. And compare that to the investments, for example, that China is making in its infrastructure that makes it an attractive place to invest. So we need to combine training and education to prepare workers and to retrain workers who have lost their jobs, but we also need to do the homework to make sure that we're creating those jobs for the trained workers to go into.
I think, incidentally, as I've talked to business leaders and I asked them to prioritize their needs, enhancing our infrastructures, either one or two, in everyone's comments. And that's one reason I'm concerned, frankly, about this tax plan, because there's going to be no money left for that. And I believe infrastructure should be, if it's not parallel, incorporated with our plans. You mentioned the Guatemalan case. Is there anything, and this is open to all our panelists, is there anything that we should learn from that case in terms of reshaping this agreement?
I'll start. The Guatemala case, it lasted for more than 9 years. So one thing is just in terms of timeliness and delay. But secondly, there's no question on the world stage that Guatemala is not enforcing its laws, any laws, labor laws, criminal laws of any kind. The UN High Commissioner on Human Rights has an office there to deal specifically with rule of law issues, and in particular, freedom of association and human rights in the economic sphere. That's exactly what we're talking about. But because the CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement, limited the way that we could enforce labor obligations, it had to be in a manner affecting trade and a sustained or recurring course of action or inaction, the panel said the U.S. had failed to prove its case. So what we've got to do is make sure that these additional hurdles to labor enforcement aren't repeated in the NAFTA. Labor obligations should be as enforceable as every other obligation, and right now with that language, they're not.
Yeah, I think a final question, and the panel can answer the previous question or this as they see fit, but looking at changes that have occurred over this time and what we should take into consideration, do you think there should be commitments about climate change as part of the NAFTA or trade agreement negotiations, and why or why not?
I would say absolutely, and the reason why is we would not want to lose high-value manufacturing, in particular, to a trading partner that says, pollute all you want, contribute to global warming all you want, you can produce here, and it'll be cheaper. And the problem is that everyone has to live with the effects of putting that high-carbon output into the global environment.
Ambassador?
Yeah, I think that I took a look at the TPP language, and I would say it's good in terms of encouraging proper environmental behavior, but I don't think it goes so far as to impose enforcement within the agreement itself. I think it allows for domestic enforcement in each of the cases, but I think it goes farther than the agreement we had back in 1993 in terms of encouraging the right kind of environmental policies. And having dealt with both Canada and Mexico on environment, I think they both want to make the environment better. I don't think there's any doubt about it. When I got to Mexico, you could barely see in front of your nose. There was so much particulate matter in the air. There was leaded gas. They hadn't gotten rid of leaded gas yet.
Yeah, I'm encouraged myself. I think that's one area where we have the three countries sharing some of these values together, and together, if we move forward on this, it'll be a strong example for other agreements as we go forward. So it's great to have some common areas where we can agree, and I want to thank you. This is a fascinating area. I'm so pleased you're here, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. You know, I only have 5 minutes, so I don't want to necessarily hear from everybody on each one of these questions, but I do generally open this up to each and every one of you, whoever chomps at the bit first. But I want to start by asking a little bit about e-commerce and some of the provisions that we should be looking at to strengthen what is going on with NAFTA and e-commerce in benefiting the United States of America. I mean, obviously, that's always a fair thing to say. We can assume that Canada will be looking in any NAFTA 2.0 to strengthen provisions for Canada. Mexico would be looking to do the same. I think they rightfully fear any intrusion of products coming in from Asia, which is probably the way most Americans feel about products that have come in from other places, even throughout our own region. But what do you see as things that we can do to strengthen e-commerce through any NAFTA 2.0 for the United States of America? Don't all start at once.
There's one thing that we could do. We've tried already in multiple fora, and it resides with the government of Mexico to make this decision, but we could change the de minimis levels for package delivery from the United States to Mexico. From an e-commerce perspective, that would have a potentially dramatic impact.
Do you see the other players, Canada and Mexico, being willing participants for compromise in this region?
This is, as I say, this has been a perennial issue between the United States and Mexico. They have indicated that they're not ready to entertain those proposals, but I think we need to continue pushing forward on that. And this is an entire industry that really didn't even exist when NAFTA was first negotiated. And I think this is, the broader point here is something that bears focus. You know, if you think back to, for example, the automobile that you were driving in 1993, mine had a tape deck in it, and that was about it. Now the automobiles are literally driving themselves. I mean, the world has changed so fundamentally, and NAFTA, the provisions in the auto sector and every other sector that are included, actually still maintain the provisions in large measure of the world as it existed in 1994 when NAFTA went into effect. This is something that from the updating perspective we really need to have a hard look at, and it can actually help the innovation agenda for all three economies, but there are some sand in the gears like the one that you've just referred to. I think that would be a good place to start.
Are you pointing to some degree in terms of the origin of parts, is that, and the percentage that we need in, say, a U.S. automobile, 62% of it being made in the region, something like that?
Certainly rules of origin plays into that, absolutely. And this is a very complicated issue, there's no question about it. We have to be careful here. With the right intentions, if we try to manage rules of origin in a way that's ultimately counterproductive from a commercial perspective, we could actually decrease production in the North American zone and force that production overseas in a way that's unhelpful to job creation in the United States. So this is something that's currently being negotiated among the three parties right now. It's something the U.S. administration has made a very high priority, and it's something that we have to watch very carefully.
Yes.
I
Ambassador,
think
by all means,
in part what Mr. Farnsworth is referring to is the fact that our negotiators are asking for an explicit U.S. content of, I believe they're asking for 50% with respect to automobiles, as opposed to a North America-wide content of the 62.5% that you referred to. And I think there's real concern amongst people who look at this that if we were to insist on that, it would damage the competitiveness of vehicles made in North America, and it wouldn't have the effect necessarily of driving production back to the United States. I think it might be taken offshore to places like Asia and Europe.
And that's what we're looking for, is production here, jobs here. This is something that we want to see. I heard a little jab over there on taxes. I think one of the most important points we can make, even it came from a Democrat president, John F. Kennedy, talked about how paradoxical it is, the relationship between lowering taxes and increasing revenue, one of my favorite quotes that exists out there. But in the aim of talking a little bit more about jobs, I have one more question. That is, do you see anything that within NAFTA that we could be renegotiating specifically to actually put Asia a little bit more on its heels? and not have to worry about necessarily the loss there, but actually put them on their heels, put them on the defensive.
I would say one of the recommendations that the AFL-CIO made was this commitment to work together as a three-party block to make sure that we're addressing tax avoidance, so the taxes that are due are collected and able to be invested in infrastructure, commitments to invest by all three countries in infrastructure so that we can build that back up and make this an attractive place. And finally, something that's very important is to have all three countries work together to cooperate on enforcement when there are non-NAFTA parties doing trade cheating, dumping, subsidizing, whatever it is, to work together to cooperate on enforcement. And that would make the U.S. enforcement a lot stronger.
Very fair. Thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your answers.
I thank the gentleman from Florida. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Negroponte, you and Mr. Farnsworth both referenced in your comments concern that if this negotiation goes awry or if the U.S. pulls out of NAFTA, that we will return to being distant neighbors with Mexico, or I think you said the relationship in the past wasn't quite as copacetic as it is today. I wonder what you both think that the president's anti-Mexico rhetoric and call to build a wall and have them pay for it is doing for our relationship with Mexico and the potential negotiations. And if this fails, do you think a wall will be able to stop the millions who will suffer as a result of the economic consequences?
Well, I think in atmospheric terms, I don't think that kind of rhetoric goes down particularly well in Mexico, and I think it contributes to a sense that the president may not regard Mexico and the Mexican people as highly as they would like. But if you go to the core of it and talk to them about it in depth, what they really care about is the NAFTA and the trading relationship, and they want to see that renewed. And I think they're prepared to tolerate a certain amount of rhetoric, provided the practical results are beneficial to them. So,
and what about in this election that's coming up? If you mentioned that perhaps some less favorable to the U.S. would get elected because of some of this rhetoric. Would you weigh in, Mr. Farnsworth?
Yes, ma'am, and thank you for the question. And I agree with Ambassador Negroponte. It's not particularly helpful, and it stigmatizes in some way the relationship. And people, they don't necessarily appreciate that. The one thing about, in reference to your question about the border wall, Ms. Drake referenced infrastructure within the United States, which I think is absolutely correct. I'm actually from Chicago, and I can verify that traffic there is complicated. But to the extent that we're also building additional obstructions or obstacles with our border with Mexico, that's only going to make the commercial relationship that much more complicated, particularly in sectors that final production is not in one country or the other, but that production actually crosses the border multiple times, for example, in the auto sector. And each time, if the border is congested or complicated, that reduces the efficiency of production, raises the cost of production, and ultimately makes U.S. manufacturing less competitive. And we have to remember that final goods that are exported from Mexico, according to the National Bureau of Economic Statistics, actually, National Bureau of Economic Research, actually include some 40% of U.S. content. So as we're making that border more complicated to cross, we're actually impacting the commercial relationship in a way that I think is very, very compelling and something we need to think hard before we do it.
Thank you. I'd also like to ask you about tourism. I represent Las Vegas, and I co-chair the Travel and Tourism Caucus, and our greatest source of tourists are Mexico and Canada. I think half of all international visits came from those two countries, 18.7 million last year from Mexico, 19.3 million from Canada. But we've seen a decrease, according to the Department of Commerce's National Travel and Tourism Office, from Mexico this past year, and some of that is tied to that same rhetoric that I mentioned. Could you discuss how a poor renegotiation or withdrawing from NAFTA would affect tourism as part of our economic interaction with these two countries? Anybody?
Well, I think it maybe in the broadest sense, if the NAFTA fails and then it has negative adverse economic consequences on Canada and Mexico, I could see a devaluation of their currency, for example, and then there'd be all sorts of knock-on effects, which might, over time, affect the ability of Mexicans to travel to the United States. But visiting the U.S. is near and dear to their hearts. A lot of visa applicants in those visa lines in Mexico are wanting to take their children to Disneyland, right? I mean, that's what they want to do, or go to Las Vegas or visit the other tourist highlights in the country.
Mr. Farnsworth?
Well, again, I think that in the broadest sense, things that would indicate that the United States is a less welcoming environment to anybody coming to visit would, I think, depress the interest from Mexicans and others, frankly, in visiting the United States as tourists.
Big difference in a wall and a welcome mat, isn't it? Thank you. I yield back.
One more time. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from California, Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing us together to talk about such an important issue between North American countries. I was recently in Mexico. I travel as part of the U.S.-Mexico Inter-Parliamentary Group. It's heartbreaking to hear how offended or how much our administration, our current president, has offended our Mexican nationals, and how he has negatively impacted our relationship with our closest neighbors to the south. Neighbors who we depend on for our national security and great partners on this issue. Ms. Drake, I agree with you on the labor and environmental issues. I think it is unfortunate that it was a second thought. It wasn't negotiated, and I think that this is an opportunity for us to really bring about labor issues, wages, and climate change issues, although we don't want to call it climate change issues anymore. I get that. Weather pattern changes, as I refer to them. Friday night, I had some gifts for my little grandbaby, and I was wrapping them. The toy was made here. The wrapping was made in China, but the ribbon, and I took a picture of it. It's on my social media. I'm happy for you if you follow me. The ribbon says it's made in Mexico from materials manufactured in the USA, Rancho Cucamonga, California, 91730. That's my neighboring city. And I was so proud of that I had to tweet out that photo because that is NAFTA. I traveled through my district and visited 17 manufacturers that say they are dependent on NAFTA to trade with, within businesses across. That means that those California workers, those California companies that are part of the Paris Agreement, that are committed to ensuring that we have air quality that we can all be proud of for our future generations, will be denied those jobs. So rather than abandoning, an agreement that might have not benefited all of our communities and all of our states in the U.S., as a matter of fact, Mexico, some parts of Mexico are just as angry as some parts of the U.S. Southern Mexico, for example, has not benefited a single job, from the NAFTA agreement. And they would say, just like some of our states would say in rural counties, it has negatively impacted them. So how do we focus on those areas and ensure that whether it's infrastructure, what are some of the ways that we can bring about this dialogue to an administration that is so much opposed to? Ms. Drake?
I would start by abandoning the us versus them rhetoric. It really isn't the United States versus Mexico versus China. And in fact, the firms that are competing, the firms are global. The profits are global. The places where profits are booked and taxes are avoided are global. The only thing that's not global are the workers themselves and the worker rights. So it really takes a change of our frame of how are we looking at this and how do we give businesses the right incentives to create jobs, not just in the U.S., but of course in the U.S., but also in Mexico and in Canada, and to make sure that those are good jobs, family wage jobs. You know, there are millions more living in poverty in Mexico now than before NAFTA. It's not all attributable to NAFTA, but there are certain things that all three countries can do to try to make a more progressive economy and to create not just any job, not just a MIC job that has no security, but really say, we're going to work on this together. And then what we're doing, if we're able to do that in the context of NAFTA, to say we're going to also continue to trade and continue to grow the trade relationship, as Chairman Poe referenced earlier, it's good for the U.S. not just because you're raising wages there, so we get a better labor market here, but you're creating new customers for U.S. exports. There are so many in Mexico right now that aren't really participating in the global economy and can't afford to buy American goods. So how can we do all of that? And there are lots of ways, and it starts with labor rights, but there are many other investments we can make.
Thank you, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Chair recognizes Ms. Frankel from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Poe. Thank you to our witnesses. So let me, I want to pick up where my colleague, Ms. Torres, left off and just say, I too agree that we have to, when we rework this agreement, we've got to improve the labor standards and also environmental standards. I want to look at this from a little different angle, maybe more from the aspect of this committee on terrorism. And that is, I have very mixed emotions when I think about this because I want to do everything possible to improve America's economy. We also have to be concerned about our security. And so I think when, Ms. Drake, I like your approach. It's not us against them, because my big concern is if we allow Mexico to go downhill to have more economic losses, well, things are going to start to happen that we don't want to happen, which will be probably more illegal immigration, more violent drug trading, more border issues. And so I would like to hear some comment on that from whoever would like to.
Could, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to say I think the cooperation on the security front with Mexico is has been at an unprecedented level. I mean, some examples would, of course, be the fact that we've been cooperating on immigration issues, not only on our common border, but also down on Mexico's border with Central America. So I think that's important. We've been working lately, doing a lot of good work on transnational crime and that kind of activity. And perhaps one that's really politically very significant for Mexico, when I was ambassador down there 25 years ago, Mexico wouldn't extradite criminals to the United States. And now they do it, and they do it without any difficulty whatsoever. And to my mind, that really represents a major shift in their approach towards cooperation with our country.
And I assume from what you're saying is that that if we just merely walked away from NAFTA, that the border cooperation, the transaction, and the other cooperation might fail.
Well, I certainly wouldn't want to wish that, nor would anybody, I don't suppose. But it might make it a little harder for them and give them a little less room for maneuver politically if they were working in the context of a failed NAFTA.
Mr. Farnsworth, I see you and Mr. Alford. You both have been shaking your head. And Mr. Drake, who wants to
I have nothing in particular to add other than to associate myself with Ambassador Negroponte's comments. I think that's exactly right. And we also have to remember Mexico's not doing this cooperation necessarily to please the United States. It's doing it because it's in its own interests. And those interests will continue no matter what happens on the north side of the border. So there will be, in my view, some continued level of cooperation. The question will be how easy it will be, how politically possible it will be, and what extent it will be. And you could paint a scenario, I think, quite easily that the next president of Mexico, whoever he or she may be, could not have the same level of political room to maneuver to cooperate with the United States. So I think that's a real risk. I wouldn't think that the cooperation would end, but I think perhaps it would become much more fraught.
Mrs. Drake, did you want to add to that?
Yes, thank you. I would just add that NAFTA has not been a magic bullet on this front. The noted economist and author Jeff Foe has done some really good work about how some of the campesinos who were pushed off the land after NAFTA ended up in the narco trafficking regime. And we also must note that rule of law continues to be a problem. A couple of years ago, 43 student teachers were kidnapped in Mexico. We still don't have a resolution of that. And just within the past couple of weeks, we had 2 labor activists who were assassinated in a worker strike at a mine. So we have lots of work to do, and the U.S. could do a much better job of pushing Mexico to make sure that it protects workers and women as part of its rule of law issues.
Thank you. Mr. Alford.
As you can tell, I believe that trade creates jobs. I ship machines overseas that allow people to build high value-added products, not just wrapping ribbons. If everybody has a job, they're able to feed their family, the world's a more tranquil place.
Thank you. Thank you all for your response. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I want to thank all of y'all, or all y'all, as we say as the plural to y'all in Texas, for being here today. The testimony has been excellent, and we appreciate your time and your information. There may be questions that members of the panel may have. They will submit that through the chair to you in writing, and then we would like a timely response, preferably before the NAFTA agreement is reached. And with that, the committee is adjourned.